Hello everybody, my name is Timothy and I want to welcome you to the Chinese Civilizations channel, a channel where we study the history of China bit by bit, video by video, so that if you are interested to know about Chinese history and civilization, and in the past thought, oh, there's such a wide subject, how can we cover this broad subject without ever going to the university? Well, in the Chinese Civilization channel, we are going to cover it video by video, dynasty by dynasty, in a way that is going to be easy for you to understand. We have done Xia Dynasty and we have also done Shang Dynasty, and in the future I might return to portions of these dynasties to explain specific part of it. But today we are going to the Zhou Dynasty, which is the longest dynasty in Chinese history. It spans 800 years, and from this dynasty we have terms such as the Western Zhou, Eastern Zhou, the Spring and Autumn period, and the Warring States period. So you might have heard of these words, but it doesn't quite register to you, or where does it fit in the chronology of Chinese civilization. But not to worry, we are going to go through them very comprehensively, and in today's video we are going to touch on the Zhou Dynasty, and so we better get along. Prologue. When we think of the great dynasties of China, the Zhou Dynasty often stands out for its sheer length and influence. Lasting for almost 800 years, from around 1046 to 256 BCE, the Zhou was not only the longest dynasty in Chinese history, but also one of the most transformative. It laid down ideas and institutions that would shape Chinese civilization for millennia to come. In this video, I want to give you a general overview of the Zhou Dynasty, its rise, its glory, its challenges, and its eventual decline. But because the Zhou period is so vast and rich in detail, I will not stop here. This will be the first in a series of videos on the Zhou, as I break the story down into more focused explorations. After this overview, I will take you deeper into the Western Zhou, the Eastern Zhou, the Spring and Autumn period, and finally the Warring States period. In doing so, I hope to give you a truly comprehensive picture of how Chinese history unfolded across these centuries. For now though, let's step back and look at the Zhou Dynasty as a whole, how it replaced the Shang, how it established a new political and spiritual order, and how it laid the foundation for philosophies and institutions that still resonates in China today. Chapter 1. The Fall of the Shang and the Rise of the Zhou. When I left off in our previous video, I told you about the Shang Dynasty, the first dynasty in Chinese history that we can confirm with real historical evidence. But as with all dynasties, the Shang eventually declined. Their last leader, Tixin, whom later generation called King Zhou of Shang, became infamous for extravagance and cruelty. Whether all the stories about him are accurate or not, the tradition is clear. The Shang rulers lost their virtue, and with it their right to rule. Out in the west, on the banks of the Wei River, there was a rising power, the Zhou people. They were once loyal vassals of the Shang, but under the leadership of King Wen of Zhou, they grew stronger. King Wen was respected as a wise and benevolent leader, but he did not live to see the Shang fall. That task was left to his son, King Wu of Zhou. In around 1046 BCE, King Wu led a coalition of allied states against the Shang at the famous Battle of Muyue. The Shang army was large, but many of its soldiers were unwilling to fight for a corrupt ruler. The Zhou forces quickly gained the upper hand and the Shang king took his own life. With that, the Shang dynasty collapsed and the Zhou emerged as the new rulers of China. For the Zhou, this victory was not only a political triumph but also a moral one. They claimed that heaven itself had withdrawn its favor from the Shang and bestowed it upon them. This idea that a dynasty ruled by the mandate of heaven would become one of the most important concepts in Chinese history, shaping how every future dynasty justified its rule. Chapter 2: Tianming, the Mandate of Heaven. One of the most important contributions of the Zhou Dynasty to Chinese civilization was the idea of the Mandate of Heaven, or Tianming. As I mentioned in the last chapter, the Zhou needed to explain why it was legitimate for them to overthrow the Shang. After all, the Shang themselves had once claimed to rule with divine support. The Zhou answer was simple yet profound. They argued that heaven, Tian, was not tied permanently to any one family or dynasty. Instead, heaven bestowed its mandate or approval upon rulers who govern with virtue, justice, and care for the people. If a ruler became corrupt or tyrannical, as the Shang king supposedly had, heaven will withdraw its mandate and grant it to another more deserving house. I find this fascinating because the mandate of heaven was not just a political slogan. It became a powerful moral standard. It implied that rulers had a responsibility to govern well. If they failed, rebellions, natural disasters, and social unrest were not just misfortunes, they were signs that heaven was displeased. In this way, the Zhou established a principle that justified both loyalty and rebellion depending on the conduct of the rulers. This idea would echo throughout Chinese history for thousands of years. Every dynasty that followed the Zhou, from the mighty Han to the short-lived Ming and even the Qing, used the mandate of heaven to explain their rise and in time their fall. It was more than an excuse. It was a philosophy of history, one that shaped how the Chinese saw the world and their rulers' place within it. Chapter 3: Establishing the Western Zhou. After their victory over the Shang, the Zhou faced the difficult task of turning conquest into stable rule. Winning a battle is one thing, but building a dynasty that could last was another matter entirely. King Wu of Zhou, the conqueror of the Shang, did not live long after his triumph. The responsibility of consolidating power fell to his son, who was still too young to rule, and to King Wu's brother, the famous Duke of Zhou, or Zhou Gong. I want to pause here because the Duke of Zhou became a legendary figure in Chinese history. He is remembered as a wise statesman who put duty above personal ambition, serving loyally as regent until his nephew came of age. The Duke of Zhou helped create the system that defined the early Zhou era. To keep the vast new realm under control, the Zhou rulers developed what we often call a feudal system, or fengjian. They granted land and authority to members of the royal family and trusted allies who ruled as lords over different regions. In return, these lords owed loyalty, military support, and ritual respect for the Zhou king. This arrangement helped knit together a large and diverse territory. The Zhou also established their capitals near what is now Xi'an, at Haojing and Fenghao. This western heartland gave the dynasty its first phase, the name we use today, the Western Zhou. It was from here that the Zhou kings govern, balancing the need to maintain central authority with the reality of delegating power to their allies. The early Zhou period is often remembered as a golden age when kings ruled with virtue and harmony, guided by the mandate of heaven. Whether or not it was truly as ideal as later writers imagined, it set the tone for centuries of Chinese political thought. The king as the son of heaven, ruling at the center of a carefully crafted hierarchy. Chapter 4: Fengjian of Feudalism and Zhou Society. To really understand the Zhou Dynasty, I think it's important to look at the political and social system they created. We often describe it as feudalism, using the Chinese word fengjian. Now, this isn't exactly the same as medieval European feudalism, but the comparison helps us imagine how it worked. The Zhou kings couldn't directly control all the land they had conquered, so they divided their realm and granted fiefs to members of the royal family and loyal allies. These regional rulers, dukes, marquesses, earls, viscounts, and barons, governed their territories almost like little kings of their own, but they owed allegiance to the Zhou king at the center. Their obligations included paying tribute, providing soldiers for war, and performing rituals that reinforced the king's role as the son of heaven. This system created a layered society. At the top was the Zhou king, followed by the regional lords. Beneath them were nobles, officials, and warriors. Ordinary farmers formed the backbone of Zhou society, working the land to support the elite through taxes and labor. At the very bottom were slaves, often prisoners of war, who were used in agriculture and construction. What I find particularly striking is how this system was tied to family and ritual. Power was often passed down through clans, and ancestral worship reinforced loyalty not just to family, but to the larger Zhou order. Every level of society mirrored the hierarchy of heaven itself, with the king at the top as the earthly representation of cosmic order. Of course, this arrangement had its weaknesses. Over time, as generations passed, those regional lords became more independent. But in the early centuries, Fengjian provided a way for the Zhou to govern a vast and diverse land, keeping unity while still allowing local rulers a measure of autonomy. Chapter 5: Ritual, Religion, and the Role of Heaven. One of the most fascinating things about the Zhou dynasty is how they link politics with religion. For the Zhou, ruling wasn't just about power, it was about maintaining harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. And the way they expressed this was through ritual, or Li. As the son of heaven, Tianzhi, the Zhou king stood at the center of this order. His role was to perform the great state rituals that ensured heaven's blessings. These ceremonies included sacrifices to heaven and earth, to ancestral spirits, and to natural forces. When the king carried them out properly, it was believed that harmony would prevail, crops would grow, rain would come at the right times, and the people would prosper. But ritual was not just for the king. Every level of society, from nobles down to ordinary families, practiced forms of ancestral worship. Families kept ancestral tablets and made offerings, believing that the spirits of their forebears still had an active role in the world of the living. By honoring their ancestors, people reinforced both family loyalty and the larger cosmic order that the Zhou believed in. I find it remarkable how deeply religion and politics were woven together. The Zhou kings weren't seen simply as rulers, they were mediators between heaven and earth. Their legitimacy depended not only on military might, but also on their moral conduct and their ability to carry out rituals correctly. If floods, famines, and rebellions occur, people question whether the king had failed in his duty, or worse, whether heaven had withdrawn its mandate. This religious political framework gave the Zhou dynasty extraordinary moral authority. At the same time, it set a standard that would hound later rulers. They could never take their mandate for granted. Chapter 6: Daily Life in the Zhou Dynasty. So far, I've talked about kings, nobles, and rituals, but what about the everyday lives of ordinary people during the Zhou Dynasty? After all, most of the populations weren't lords or warriors, they were farmers, craftsmen, and families trying to make a living. Agriculture was the foundation of Zhou Dynasty. Most people worked the land, growing millet, wheat, and later rice. They raised livestock like cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses. Farming was labor-intensive, and peasants owed part of their harvest as tax or tribute to their lords. This meant that while they lived simply, their work supported the entire structure of Zhou society, from the nobles who fought wars to the priests who carried out rituals. Life in Zhou villages was organized around family and clan. Families lived in simple wooden houses with thatched roofs, often grouped together within walled settlements for protection. Extended families stayed close, bound by the practice of ancestor worship, which reminded everyone of their duty not only to their living relatives but also to those who had come before. Craftsmen and artisans form another vital part of Zhou life. They produced bronze vessels for rituals, tools for farming, and weapons for war. With the growing use of iron during the later Zhou period, tools became more efficient, helping to expand agricultural production and, in time, population growth. I also find it interesting that leisure and culture played a role even for common people. Music, poetry, and storytelling were part of life, especially during festivals and family gatherings. Some of the earliest Chinese songs and poems, later compiled in the Book of Song, Shi Jing, give us a glimpse into the thoughts and emotions of ordinary Zhou people. Daily life may have been humble, but it was deeply rooted in the rhythms of nature, the cycles of agriculture, and the shared values of family and tradition. Together, these simple lives formed the bedrock on which the Zhou dynasty stood. Chapter 7: The Zhou and the Barbarians, Yi, Rong, Di, and Hu. One thing I always remind myself when studying the Zhou dynasty is that they didn't exist in isolation. The Zhou were surrounded by many other peoples, tribes, and cultures that they often label as barbarians. In Chinese sources, you come across names like Yi to the east, the Rong, the Di to the west and north, and later the Hu. These groups lived on the fringes of the Zhou world, and their relationship with the dynasty was complex. The Zhou thought of themselves as the center of civilization, guided by ritual, order, and the mandate of heaven. By contrast, they saw these neighboring peoples as outsiders, living without the refinement of Zhou culture. Yet the reality was more nuanced. Sometimes the Zhou fought these groups, defending their borders from raids. Other times, they traded with them, exchanged goods, or even intermarried. What I find fascinating is how the Zhou dynasty was defined in part by this contrast. to be Chinese, to belong to the Zhou order, meant living within a world of ritual and hierarchy. The presence of outsiders reinforced the sense that the Zhou were unique bearers of civilization. But the barbarians were not just a threat or a foil. They also played a role in shaping Zhou history. For example, during times of weakness, when the Zhou kings struggled to maintain authority, these frontier peoples grew bolder, sometimes allying with rebellious lords inside Zhou territory. In fact, the Western Zhou eventually fell in part because of attacks from the Rong tribes, who sacked the Zhou capital and forced the dynasty to retreat eastward. So, the Zhou-barbarian relationship was one of tension, exchange, and influence. It reminds me that Chinese civilization, even at this early stage, was never entirely closed off. It was defined both by what it absorbed and by what it resisted. Chapter 8: The Eastern Zhou or Dongzhou and the shifting balance of power. As I move further into the Zhou story, there's a major turning point that can't be overlooked. That is, the fall of the Western Zhou and the rise of the Eastern Zhou. This shift marks the start of a very different chapter in Chinese history. The Western Zhou collapsed around 771 BCE when the capital at Haojing was attacked by the Rong tribes, aided by rebellious Zhou lords. The king was killed, and the surviving Zhou court had to flee eastward to Luoyang. From this point forward, we speak of the Eastern Zhou or Dongzhou. Now, what's crucial here is that while the Zhou dynasty continued in name, their real power was gone. The Zhou kings in Luoyang still carried the title of Son of Heaven, Tianzhi, but in practice, they were more like figureheads. The true power shifted into the hands of the regional lords, the dukes, marquises, and other nobles who now ruled their own territories with increasing independence. This weakening of central authority gave rise to what we might call a feudal mosaic, many small states, each with its own armies, wealth, and ambitions. At first, these lords still paid some respect to the Zhou kings, but gradually they began to act like kings themselves. For me, what stands out about this movement is how the Zhou dynasty still mattered even when its power was hollow. The Zhou king's ritual authority and the mandate of heaven continued to serve as symbols of legitimacy. Rival states would invoke the king's blessing to justify their wars, even though they no longer truly answered to him. The Eastern Zhou was therefore an age of fragmentation, but also of remarkable dynamism. It set the stage for the famous Spring and Autumn and Warring States periods, when ideas, warfare, and politics all flourish in new and transformative ways. Chapter 9: The Spring and Autumn Period, 春秋时期. The first major phase of the Eastern Zhou is what we call the Spring and Autumn Period, 春秋时期, lasting from around 770 to 476 BCE. It takes its name from the Spring and Autumn Annals, 春秋, a chronicle traditionally attributed to Confucius. This was a time when the Zhou king's authority was little more than ceremonial. The real power lay in the hands of the feudal states, each ruled by its own duke, marquis, or prince. There were hundreds of states at the beginning, though over time many were absorbed by larger and stronger neighbors. What fascinates me about the Spring and Autumn period is the way shifting alliances and rivalries shaped the politics of the time. States constantly fought for dominance, Yet no single power could truly unify them. Instead, what emerged was the system of hegemonies. From time to time, a particularly strong ruler, such as Duke Huan of Qi or Qi Huan Gong, or Duke Wen of Jin or Jin Wen Gong, would rise to the status of hegemon, Pa. These leaders claimed to protect the Zhou royal house and maintain order, but in reality, they acted as de facto overlords of the other states. Life during these periods was marked by both turbulence and creativity. Warfare became more frequent, but it was still limited compared to what would later come. At the same time, intellectual currents began to stir. Thinkers like Confucius or Gongzi lived during this age, reflecting deeply on questions of morality, order, and the role of rulers in society. For me, the spring and autumn period represents a world in transition, one where the old Zhou order was fading, but the seeds of new ideas and new powers were being planted. It was a time when loyalty, diplomacy, and strategy mattered as much as brute force, and when the future of Chinese civilization was being quietly reshaped. Chapter 10: The Warring States Period, or 战国时期. After the spring and autumn period, China entered an even more turbulent era, the Warring States Period, or 战国时期, which lasted from 475 to 221 BCE. This was a time of constant warfare, profound change, and dramatic innovation. At the beginning, there were still many states, though through centuries of conquest and consolidation, only 7 major powers emerged: Qi, Chu, Yan, Han, Cao, Wei, and Qin. These states fought each other endlessly, each striving for dominance. What makes the warring states so fascinating to me is how war drove progress. Military technology advanced with the widespread use of iron weapons and the crossbow. Armies grew from small aristocratic warrior bands into massive conscripted forces numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Fortifications, siege engines, and new strategies made warfare more destructive than ever before. But this was also an age of extraordinary intellectual flowering. Competing states became laboratories for political ideas as rulers sought better ways to govern and win loyalty. This is when the 100 school of thought, 诸子百家, thrived. Confucianism, 儒家, Taoism, 道家, Mohism, 墨家, and legalism, 法家, all emerged or took shape in this period. Each offered its own vision of order and justice, and many of these philosophies still shape Chinese culture to this day. The balance of power kept shifting, but in the end, it was the western state of Qin that proved most ruthless and effective. Under leaders like King Cheng, who would later become Qin Shi Huang, the Qin defeated the other states one by one. By 221 BCE, the Warring States period ended with the unification of China under the Qin Dynasty, the first true imperial dynasty in Chinese history. For me, the Warring States is both a story of bloodshed and brilliance. It was a crucible of ideas and power struggles where the old Zhou world finally gave way to something entirely new, an empire that would set the model for centuries to come. Chapter 11: Zhou Society and Culture. Beyond politics and warfare, I want to take a closer look at the society and culture of the Zhou Dynasty because this is where we really see the foundations of Chinese civilization being laid out. Zhou society was organized around hierarchy and family. At the very top stood the king, followed by nobles who controlled fiefdoms, then warriors, peasants, and slaves at the bottom. This structure reflected the Zhou feudal system where loyalty and landholding were intertwined. But just as important was the family. In Zhou culture, the family was not just a household, it was a sacred lineage stretching back through ancestors and forward to future generations. This sense of continuity was reinforced through Li, ritual, and proper conduct. Ritual defined how people interacted with their ancestors, their rulers, and even one another. Over time, these rituals became deeply codified, providing the ethical framework that thinkers like Confucius would later expand into moral philosophy. Material culture also flourished. The Zhou inherited Shang bronze traditions, but they took them further, using bronzes not just for weapons and vessels, but as symbols of power and prestige. The famous 9-tripod cauldron was said to represent the authority of the entire realm. Meanwhile, music, poetry, and literature were central to Zhou life. The Book of Songs, one of the 5 classics, preserves hymns, folk songs, and courtly verses from this period. When I read them, I find an intimate glimpse into Zhou daily life, love songs, harvest celebrations, laments of soldiers, and praises to kings. Even architecture and urban planning carried Zhou cultural marks. Palaces, ancestral temples, and walled cities reflected both practical needs and ritual order. Society itself was understood as a reflection of the cosmic harmony between heaven, earth, and humanity. To me, Zhou culture shows how civilization is not just about survival, but about meaning. The Zhou wove together politics, ritual, art, and family life into a coherent worldview, one that would influence China for thousands of years. Chapter 12: The Legacy of the Zhou Dynasty, 周朝的遗产. As I come to the close of this overview, I want to reflect on the legacy of the Zhou Dynasty. For me, the Zhou is not just another chapter in Chinese history, it is the dynasty that shaped the very framework of what Chinese civilization would become. First and foremost, the Zhou gave us the concept of the mandate of heaven, Tianming. This idea that heaven grants authority to a just ruler and withdraws it from a corrupt one became the moral and political foundation for every dynasty that followed. Whenever a new dynasty arose, it was explained through the Zhou principle of heaven's mandate. Second, the Zhou defined China's cultural and social order through Li, ritual, propriety, and correct conduct. These practices, codified during the Zhou, were later developed into Confucian philosophy and embedded deeply into Chinese life. Third, the Zhou was the cradle of Chinese thought. The Eastern Zhou period produced the 100 schools of thought, including Confucianism, Taoism, Mohism, and legalism. These schools debated how best to achieve order, justice, and harmony, and their ideas remain alive even today. And finally, the Zhou reminds us of the cycles of history. It began with strength and vision, declined into fragmentation, and eventually gave way to unification under the Qin. But in its rise and fall, the Zhou left behind a legacy far greater than its kings or battles. It gave China its enduring philosophy, its rituals, its values, and its sense of political legitimacy. When I look back at the Zhou Dynasty, I see it as a bridge connecting the myth and ritual world of the Shang with the imperial grandeur that would follow under the Qin and Han. It was during the Zhou that China became not just a land of kingdoms, but a civilization of ideas. And for that reason, the Zhou's influence is still with us even after more than 2,000 years. Epilogue. As I reach the end of this journey through the Zhou Dynasty, I want to pause and reflect on what we have seen together. The Zhou was not a short-lived kingdom. It was a dynasty that spanned nearly 8 centuries, shaping the heart and soul of Chinese civilization. We began with the founding of the Zhou under King Wu, who justified his conquest with the mandate of heaven. We followed the dynasty's rise during the Western Zhou, its struggles and fragmentation in the Eastern Zhou, and its eventual decline through the Spring and Autumn and Warring States periods. Along the way, we encountered kings, battles, philosophers, poets, and a society that was constantly adapting to change. But more than just kings and wars, what I find most powerful about the Zhou is how its legacy endured. The principles of heaven's mandate, the importance of ritual and family, the flourishing of philosophy, and the birth of a political order that tied morality to power, these shaped China for millennia to come. Even when the Zhou kings had lost their real power, the idea of the Zhou continued to inspire and legitimize those who came after. And yet, this video has only been an introduction. As I mentioned at the start, the Zhou dynasty is so vast and so important that I will be dedicating several more videos to explore it in depth, covering the Western Zhou, the Eastern Zhou, the Spring and Autumn period, and finally the Warring States period, before we arrive at the Great Unification under the Qin. Each of these episodes will give us a chance to look closer, to really understand the struggles, innovations, and the people of those times. So, as we close here, I invite you to stay with me on this journey through the ages. The Zhou dynasty may be gone, but its spirit still whispers through China's history, guiding us as we trace the story of a civilization that continues to shape our world.